I stared at my reflection in the restaurant window, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. 3 years had passed since I'd last attended one of these family dinners. 3 years of silence, of rebuilding, of becoming someone they'd never bothered to see. Tonight would be different. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because I needed them to see, truly see, the person they had dismissed for so long. The restaurant stood exactly as I remembered it, Bellini's, with its warm amber lighting and the faint scent of rosemary and olive oil that had followed me through childhood memories. Except now, the deed to this place sat in my office safe, alongside other quiet accomplishments they'd never asked about. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. I straightened my charcoal blazer, checked my watch, 15 minutes early, as always, and pushed. Open the door. The familiar chime announced my arrival, though no one was waiting for me yet. My family operated on their own time, a subtle power play I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Being the first one seated meant enduring those moments when they'd arrive, one by one, with performative exclamations of, "Oh, you're already here," as if my punctuality was some kind of character flaw. Marco, the manager I'd spoken with earlier that day, caught my eye and nodded discreetly. He understood the plan. Simple, quiet, nothing theatrical. Just a moment of truth served alongside dessert. I chose our usual table near the back, the one beneath the painting of the Amalfi Coast. My mother always insisted on sitting there, claiming the light made her look younger. I deliberately took the chair facing away from the window, her preferred seat. A small rebellion, but tonight was about reclaiming space, both literal and emotional. At precisely 6:30, they arrived together, a united front. My mother, elegant in navy blue, her pearls catching the light. My father, slightly stooped now but still commanding in his tailored suit. My older brother, Michael, who'd taken over Dad's accounting firm with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. And my sister, Elise, perfect as always, her diamond engagement ring prominently displayed like a trophy. They moved as a unit, laughing at something Michael had said, not noticing me until they were halfway to the table. "Rebecca," my mother's voice carried that familiar note of surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to show up despite confirming yesterday. "You're early." I stood to greet them, accepting their perfunctory hugs, the kind that avoided actual contact, all shoulders. "And air. On time, actually," I corrected gently, gesturing to my watch. "Same thing," Michael laughed, slapping me on the back like I was one of his golf buddies. "Still wearing that old thing? I thought you'd have upgraded by now." The watch had been a gift to myself after my first major property acquisition, a quiet celebration nobody had witnessed. Its understated elegance masked its value, much like I had learned to do with my achievements. "It keeps perfect time," I said simply. "That's all that matters." We settled into our seats, the choreography familiar even after years apart. My father ordered wine without consulting anyone's preferences. Red, dry, expensive enough to impress but not so costly that he couldn't complain about the price later. My mother immediately began adjusting everything on the table, the flower arrangement, the placement of the bread basket, the angle of her napkin, marking her territory. "So," Elise said, flashing her ring again as she reached for a breadstick, "I was just telling Mom about the venue Thomas and I found for the wedding. It's absolutely divine. Overlooks the entire bay. Of course, it cost a fortune to book, but Thomas's family insisted." "How wonderful," I said, genuinely meaning it despite the undercurrent in her voice. The subtle reminder that her fiancé came from money, old money, the kind our parents respected. "And Michael just closed that deal with Henderson Industries," my father added, pride evident in every syllable. "Biggest client the firm has ever had." Michael leaned back in his chair, satisfaction radiating from him. They practically begged us to take them on. Said they'd been watching how we handled the Westfield portfolio. That's impressive, I offered, though I knew Henderson Industries had been struggling lately. Information that came through channels in my investment network. And what about you, dear? My mother turned to me with that expression I knew too. Well, polite interest thinly veiling preemptive disappointment. Are you still doing that? What was it again? Administrative work? 5 years ago, I'd told them I was taking an entry-level position at a real estate investment firm. What I hadn't shared was how quickly I'd advanced, or that I'd started my own company 3 years ago. They had decided who I was long ago, the underachiever, the cautious one, the disappointment, and I had stopped correcting their narrative. I'm still in real estate, I said simply. Oh, still answering phones for that little agency? Elise smiled sympathetically. Well, not everyone can be ambitious. There's something to be said for consistency. The waiter approached, not Marco, but a younger man named Alex, whom I'd met during the purchase negotiations. He recognized me immediately, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he looked between me and my family. Good evening, he said professionally. May I start you with some appetizers? My father ordered calamari and bruschetta for the table without asking what anyone wanted. When Alex turned to me last, there was a moment of hesitation. He knew I owned the place but was following Marco's instructions not to acknowledge it yet. And for you, ma'am. Just water for now, thank you, I said quietly. As soon as Alex left, Michael launched into a story about his recent golf tournament, complete with exaggerated swings that nearly knocked over the wine glasses. My mother hung on every word, while my father nodded approvingly. Elise chimed in, with details about her upcoming bachelorette weekend in Napa Valley. I sat, watching them perform the same family dynamic I'd grown up with, the golden children shining while I faded into the background. But tonight, the familiar ache of exclusion felt different. I observed them like an anthropologist might study a strange cultural ritual, with curiosity rather than pain. The appetizers arrived, and Michael reached across to take the largest piece of calamari before anyone else could touch the plate. Some things never changed. So, Rebecca, my father said suddenly, as if just remembering I was there. Your mother tells me you're still living in that same apartment downtown. Don't you think it's time you found something in a better neighborhood? That area is hardly safe. My apartment, my first real estate purchase, was in a rapidly developing area that had tripled in value since I'd bought it. I now owned the entire building, but they didn't know that. I'm comfortable there, I replied. Comfortable, my mother repeated, making it sound like I'd settled for mediocrity. Well, I suppose at your age, comfortable is appropriate. I was 34, 2 years younger than Michael, and 3 years older than Elise. Rebecca's never been one to take risks, Michael added, as if explaining me to an outsider. Remember how she wouldn't even go on the roller coaster at Cedar? Point, always playing it safe. I remembered that day clearly. I'd been 12, and my fear of heights was at its peak. What they didn't know was that I'd gone back years later, alone, and rode every roller coaster in the park twice. It had become something of a personal tradition, marking milestones with quiet acts of courage they'd never witness. Speaking of, playing it safe, Elise interjected. Don't you think it's time you started dating again, Becca? I know this wonderful guy at Thomas's firm. He's a bit awkward, but I think you two would really hit it off. The implication was clear. She was offering me her fiancé's less successful colleague, a charitable act of matchmaking for her spinster sister. I'm focusing on my career right now, I said, the phrase deliberately vague yet impossible to argue. With what career? Michael laughed, not unkindly but with genuine bewilderment, as if the concept was absurd. Answering phones isn't exactly a career path with a ladder to climb. I felt my cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from the effort of holding back. 3 years ago, I would have defended myself, tried to explain the complexity of what I actually did, only to be talked over or dismissed. Tonight, I simply smiled and reached for my water. The waiter returned to take our entree orders. My father spoke for my mother without asking her preference. The salmon, no capers, dressing on the side. Elise ordered a salad, Michael the most expensive steak on the menu. When it was my turn, I ordered the mushroom risotto, a dish I knew wasn't actually on the menu, but one the chef made especially for me whenever I dropped by for impromptu business dinners. Alex didn't miss a beat. "Excellent choice, ma'am. Chef Paolo will be delighted." My mother's eyebrows furrowed slightly. "I don't see that on the menu." "It's a special," I said simply. "Since when do you order off-menu?" Michael asked, something like suspicion in his voice. "You always get the same chicken penny thing." I shrugged. I decided to try something new. "Well," my mother said, smoothing her napkin. "Speaking of new things, did you know the Henderson's daughter? You remember her, Rebecca? The one who was in your class? She just made partner at her law firm in Chicago. 34, just like you, and already a partner. Your father and I always said you had the mind for law school. What they meant was that I'd had the grades, but, in their opinion, lacked the ambition or confidence to pursue anything challenging. What they didn't know was that I'd considered law school, but found I had a natural talent for real estate investment, seeing potential where others saw only decay, understanding market trends before they emerged, building relationships with developers and city planners that proved invaluable. I'm happy with the choices I've made," I said quietly. Michael snorted. "Are you, though? I mean, look at us." He gestured to himself, Elise, and our parents. "And look at you. We're all moving forward, building something. You're just existing." The word struck with precision, hitting the exact insecurity I'd carried for years, but now they felt like arrows aimed at a ghost. The version of me that had died 3 years ago. The night I'd walked out of a family dinner much like this one, tears streaming down my face, vowing never to subject myself to their judgment again. I had kept that vow until tonight. "Not everyone measures success the same way, Michael," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "True," my father interjected, "but some metrics are universal. Career advancement, property ownership, family formation. These are the benchmarks of a life well lived." I almost laughed at the irony of him mentioning property ownership, if he only knew. Instead, I took a sip of water and changed the subject. "How is Aunt Meredith? I heard she was thinking of selling her house." My mother sighed dramatically. "Oh, it's a disaster. The place needs so much work and she's asking far too much. No one in their right mind would pay what she's asking for a house in that condition, in that neighborhood." I knew exactly how much Aunt Meredith was asking. I'd discreetly helped her set the price based on comparable properties in the area. The neighborhood was on the verge of a renaissance, with 3 major development projects breaking ground within the year. Her house would likely sell above asking within a week of listing. "I hope it works out for her," I said neutrally. Our entrees arrived and conversation temporarily halted as everyone assessed their meals. My risotto was perfect, creamy, with just the right balance of earthiness from the mushrooms and brightness from the lemon zest. Chef Paolo had outdone himself. "How is your special risotto?" Elise asked, a hint of skepticism in her voice, as she picked at her salad. "Delicious," I replied. "Would you like to try some?" She wrinkled her nose slightly. "No thanks. I'm watching my carbs before the wedding." Michael cut into his steak with unnecessary force. "So, Rebecca, when exactly are you going to get a real job? I mean, at some point you have to stop floating and start building something substantial." Before I could respond, my mother jumped in. "Michael, she has a job. It's just not ambitious. But that's Rebecca's way. She's always been the cautious one." "Cautious is one word for it," my father muttered. I set down my fork, suddenly tired of the familiar script. For years, I'd played my assigned role in their family drama, the disappointing daughter, the underachiever, the cautionary tale they used to validate their own choices. I had accepted their definition of me because fighting it seemed pointless. But somewhere along the way, in the quiet spaces between their judgments, I had begun to define myself. Do you remember when I told you I was taking that entry-level job at Wellington Properties? I asked, my voice soft but clear. My mother nodded vaguely. That little real estate office, yes. You were so excited about answering phones. I wasn't answering phones, I said. I was brought on as a junior analyst. Within 6 months, I was managing their acquisition team. Michael frowned. No, that can't be right. You would have told us if you'd gotten a promotion like that. I did tell you. At Christmas dinner that year. You were all talking about Michael's new boat, and I mentioned that I'd been promoted. Dad said, "That's nice," and then asked Michael about the boat's horsepower. A flicker of discomfort crossed my father's face, perhaps a faint recognition of a moment forgotten. Well, even if that's true, Elise interjected, managing a team at a small agency is hardly... I left Wellington 3 years ago, I continued, calmly. I started my own investment firm. We specialize in commercial real estate development and urban renewal projects. Silence fell over the table. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. My father's expression shifted from dismissal to confusion. Michael and Elise exchanged glances. Your own firm? My father finally asked, his tone suggesting I must be exaggerating. Yes, I said simply. We're small but growing. We've had some success. What kind of success? Michael challenged, clearly skeptical. Like you've sold a few condos? I could have told them then about the office complex in the financial district, the mixed-use development breaking ground next spring, the historical theater renovation that had made the front page of the business section. I could have mentioned the team of 15 people who reported to me, or the investment portfolio that had consistently outperformed market projections. Instead, I just smiled. We're doing well. Well, my mother said after an awkward pause. That's surprising. Why haven't you mentioned any of this before? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Why hadn't I shared my successes? Why had I allowed them to believe I was still answering phones? You never asked, I said simply. The silence that followed felt different from the many silences I'd endured at this table over the years. This wasn't the silence of dismissal or boredom. This was the silence of recalculation, of mental gymnastics as they tried to reconcile the version of me they'd created with the glimpse of reality I'd just offered. Michael recovered first, his competitive nature unable to process the possibility that I might have achieved something substantial without his knowledge or guidance. Well, anyone can start a firm, he said, making air quotes with his fingers. That doesn't mean it's successful. What's your annual revenue? How many employees do you have? What's your market share? My father leaned forward, suddenly interested. Yes, what exactly constitutes success in your view, Rebecca? Numbers speak louder than vague assertions. 3 years ago, their interrogation would have made me shrink, stumble over my words, provide facts and figures only to have them minimized or questioned. But I'd spent the intervening years in boardrooms and negotiations, holding my own against developers and investors far more intimidating than my family. Success, to me, means building something sustainable, I replied calmly. Something that contributes value to the community, to the people who work with me, to my own sense of purpose. That's not an answer, my father said dismissively. That's a greeting card. I smiled slightly. Perhaps, but it's my greeting card. Elise, always quick to sense tension, tried to redirect. Well, I think it's great that you've found something fulfilling, Rebecca. Not everyone needs to be at the top of their field to be happy. The condescension in her voice was so familiar, so expected, that it almost felt comforting, like an old sweater worn thin at the elbows but kept for sentimental reasons. "Thank you, Elise," I said. "How are the wedding plans coming? Have you decided on a florist yet?" The relief on her face was palpable as she launched into a detailed description of her flower arrangements, color schemes, and bridesmaids' drama. The spotlight shifted away from me, exactly as I'd intended. I'd learned long ago that the easiest way to disappear in my family was to ask them about themselves. As Elise talked and my parents nodded approvingly, I caught Michael studying me with a puzzled expression. Of all my family members, he was the most perceptive and the most threatened by anything that challenged the established hierarchy. The waiter came to clear our plates, and my father immediately asked about dessert menus. "I'm sorry, sir," Alex said politely, "but Chef Paolo has prepared a special dessert selection for the table this evening, if that's acceptable." My father, who prided himself on his sophisticated palate, nodded appreciatively. "Of course, excellent." I caught Alex's eye, another small part of the plan falling into place. Chef Paolo knew exactly which desserts to prepare. We had discussed it earlier that day. "So," my mother said, turning back to me with renewed curiosity, "this firm of yours, what's it called? Perhaps your father knows it." My father had been in accounting for 40 years, specializing in high-net-worth clients and businesses in our city. He prided himself on knowing every significant player in the local economy. "Meridian Capital Partners," I said quietly. The reaction was immediate. My father's expression shifted from dismissive to stunned. Meridian Capital Partners had made headlines last year with the acquisition of the old Harborview Hotel, a landmark building that we were converting into luxury, apartments and retail space. It was the largest real estate deal in the city in a decade. "You're with Meridian?" he asked carefully. "I founded Meridian," I corrected gently. 3 years ago. Michael's face had gone slightly pale. "That's impossible. Meridian is run by R.J. Morgan." I smiled. "My middle name is Jane. Rebecca Jane Morgan. I use R.J. professionally." The pieces were clicking into place for them now. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass. My father was mentally reviewing every business conversation he'd had about Meridian, every time he'd spoken about R.J. Morgan without realizing the connection. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked, her voice smaller now. I could have said many things in that moment. I could have reminded them of the countless times they'd talked over me, dismissed my achievements, or assumed my silence meant I had nothing worth saying. I could have pointed out that they had never shown interest in my career beyond using it as evidence of my mediocrity. I could have mentioned the time my mother had changed the subject when I tried to tell her about my first independent deal, or how my father had taken a phone call during the one time I'd attempted to explain my business model to him. Instead, I simply said, it never seemed relevant to our conversations. Elise, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "But Rebecca, Meridian is... Everybody knows about the Harborview project." "Yes," I acknowledged. "It's going well." My father cleared his throat. "The financing for that project must have been substantial. How did you manage to secure it?" The question held a hint of suspicion, as if I must have done something improper, to achieve what he couldn't believe I was capable of achieving on merit alone. "I presented a solid business plan to the right investors," I said. The numbers made sense. Michael was scrolling through his phone now, presumably looking up Meridian Capital Partners. His eyes widened slightly at whatever he found. "This says Meridian has completed over $200 million in transactions since founding," he said accusingly, as if I'd been caught in a lie. "That's not entirely accurate," I replied. "The actual figure is closer to $250 million now. The dessert arrived then, a selection of Chef Paolo's specialties arranged on a beautiful platter. Tiramisu for my mother, her favorite, though she'd never admit to enjoying something so caloric. dark chocolate torte for my father, cannoli for Michael, and panna cotta with fresh berries for Elise. For me, a simple lemon sorbet, cleansing and bright, exactly what I preferred after a heavy meal. How did Chef know exactly what each of us would like? My mother asked, genuinely puzzled. I didn't answer directly. Paolo is very intuitive. My father was still processing the revelation about Meridian. Rebecca, if what you're saying is true. It is, I interjected softly. Then you must have... That is, your financial situation must be quite different from what we'd assumed. There it was, the shift from dismissal to calculation. Suddenly, I wasn't foolish Rebecca with her dead-end job. I was Rebecca with resources, Rebecca with connections, Rebecca who might be useful. My situation is comfortable, I said, the understatement hanging in the air between us. Well, this is wonderful news, my mother exclaimed, her voice too bright, too eager to paper over years of indifference. We should celebrate. Why didn't you say something sooner? We've been worried about you all this time. The rewriting of history had begun already. In her version, they had been concerned parents watching their struggling daughter with loving apprehension, not people who had used my perceived failures to highlight their own successes. I wasn't aware you were worried, I said mildly. An uncomfortable silence fell again. Michael resumed scrolling through his phone, no doubt researching every detail he could find about Meridian and its mysterious founder, R.J. Morgan. Elise pushed her panna cotta around her plate, her appetite apparently diminished by the shifting family dynamics. My parents exchanged glances loaded with silent communication, reassessing, recalibrating their approach to the daughter they thought they knew. So, my father finally said, his tone deliberately casual, you must know Theodore Blackwell then. He's one of my clients, real estate investor, very savvy. I believe he mentioned something about being involved with the Harborview project. I nodded, knowing exactly what he was doing. Theodore Blackwell was one of the largest real estate investors in the region, known for his shrewd deals and impressive portfolio. My father was name-dropping, attempting to establish that he moved in the same circles I did, to level the playing field that had suddenly tilted away from him. Ted was an early investor in Meridian, I confirmed. He's been very supportive. Ted, Michael repeated, raising an eyebrow at the familiar form of address. We serve on the Economic Development Committee together, I explained. My father's expression shifted again. The Economic Development Committee was an influential group of business leaders who advised the mayor on commercial growth initiatives. Membership was by invitation only, and the waiting list was years long. I wasn't aware you were involved in civic matters, my mother said, a new note of respect in her voice that made something inside me ache. All those years hungry for that tone, and now that I heard it, it felt hollow. There's a lot you weren't aware of, I said quietly. The waiter approached again. Is everything to your satisfaction? My father, eager to reassert his authority, in some small way, nodded magnanimously. Excellent desserts. Please convey our compliments to the chef. I certainly will, Alex replied. Chef Paolo always appreciates feedback, especially from friends of the owner. He said it casually, naturally, as if it were a typical courtesy extended to all diners, but the effect on my family was immediate. 4 pairs of eyes turned to me, questions forming. Friends of the owner? My mother repeated slowly. I took a small bite of my sorbet, letting the tartness of lemon wash over my tongue. 3 years of silence, of building my life brick by careful brick while they continued to believe I was still trapped in the foundation. 3 years of letting them define me by my absence rather than correcting their assumptions. It hadn't been a deliberate deception, just a quiet decision to stop seeking validation from people who had never really seen me. Yes, I said finally. Paolo and I have become good friends over the past few years. You know the owner of Bellini's? Elise asked, confusion evident in her furrowed brow. I considered how to answer, how much to reveal, how quickly. This moment had played out differently in my imagination. I had pictured a grand revelation, stunned faces, perhaps even apologies for years of underestimation. But sitting here now, watching them process each new piece of information about my life with a mixture of disbelief and calculation, I felt strangely deflated. What had I really come here to prove? And to whom? I know Bellini's very well, I said carefully. Michael, ever direct, cut to the chase. Rebecca, do you know the owner of this restaurant, yes or no? I met his gaze steadily. Yes, Michael, I do. How? He demanded. How does someone like you know the owner of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city? Someone like you. The words hung in the air between us, laden with all the assumptions and limitations he had placed on me over the years. In those 3 words was the essence of how they saw me. Small, ineffectual, predictable Rebecca, who couldn't possibly have connections or influence beyond their understanding. I purchased Bellini's 18 months ago, I said quietly, along with the building it occupies and the 3 adjoining properties on this block. Complete silence fell over the table. My mother's hand flew to her pearls, fingers clutching them, as if for support. My father's face had gone utterly still, his dessert fork suspended halfway between plate and mouth. Elisa's eyes had widened to an almost comical degree. Michael's expression was the most complex, a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and something that might have been fear. That's impossible, he finally said. This building is owned by Morgan Holdings, LLC. Everyone knows that. I smiled slightly. Morgan Holdings is a subsidiary of Meridian Capital Partners. But why? My mother asked, genuinely perplexed. Why? Would you buy a restaurant? And why wouldn't you tell us? The question was so typical of her, focusing on the wrong details, missing the larger implications. In her mind, the issue wasn't that she had consistently underestimated her daughter for decades. It was that said daughter had failed to update her on a business acquisition. Bellini's was one of several properties in a package deal, I explained, the simplified version of a complex transaction involving zoning variances, tax incentives, and historical preservation credits. It was a sound investment. And you didn't tell us because, my father prompted, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer but wanted me to say it aloud. I looked around the table at the 4 people who had shaped so much of my self-perception, who had carved out a role for me in the family narrative that had never fit. The cautious one, the underachiever, the disappointment. I thought about all the times I had left family gatherings with a knot in my stomach and tears threatening to spill. All the nights I had lain awake replaying their casual cruelties and wondering what was wrong with me that my own family couldn't see any value in who I was. I didn't tell you, I said slowly, choosing my words with care, because you never asked the right questions. You decided who I was years ago, and you stopped looking for evidence to the contrary. That's not fair, Elise protested. We've always supported you. Have you? I asked gently. When was the last time any of you asked me about my work without immediately comparing it to someone else's achievements? When was the last time you listened, really listened, when I tried to share something important to me? We listen, my mother insisted, though her eyes darted away from mine. No, you don't, I said, with no anger in my voice, just quiet certainty. You hear, but you don't listen. There's a difference. My father, practical as always, was already moving past the emotional aspects to the financial implications. So, you own this building, this whole block. That must represent a significant investment. And Meridian Capital Partners, your company, that's behind the West Side Development Project as well, isn't it? And the old theater renovation downtown. I nodded, watching as he mentally calculated the value of these projects, revising his estimation of my net worth with each new piece of information. Rebecca, he said, his voice taking on the tone he used with important clients. We should talk about your portfolio diversification. With holdings of that size, you need proper tax planning. The firm could— Dad, I interrupted gently. I have a team of financial advisors and tax attorneys, but thank you for the concern. His expression faltered slightly, unused to having his professional expertise declined, especially by his own daughter. For so long, I had been the one who needed guidance, who couldn't possibly navigate the complex world without their superior wisdom. The shift in dynamic was palpable. Michael had been unusually quiet, still processing the revelations. Now he looked at me with narrowed eyes. Why tonight? Why reveal all this now, after 3 years of letting us think you were still just ordinary? It was such a Michael question. Direct, slightly accusatory, but perceptive. Of all my family members, he had always been the one most attuned to strategy and timing, because I needed to know, I said simply. Know what? Elise asked. If anything would be different if I wasn't who you thought I was. I set down my spoon beside the half-finished sorbet. If you would see me differently if my bank account had more zeros, if success by your definition would finally make me visible in this family. My mother's face crumpled slightly. Rebecca, that's a terrible thing to say. We've always loved you, exactly as you are. No, I said gently. You've loved who you thought I was, and who you thought I was wasn't someone you respected very much. That's not true, my father insisted, though his eyes couldn't quite meet mine. Isn't it? I asked. When I was just an administrator at a small real estate office, did you ever ask my opinion on business matters? Did you ever consider that I might have insights worth hearing? Did you ever look at me with the same pride you show when Michael closes a deal or Elise announces another achievement? None of them answered. The truth hung in the air between us, uncomfortable but undeniable. I didn't come here tonight for an apology, I continued. I came because I needed to close this chapter, to stop being defined by your perception of me, even in my own mind. So this was all some kind of test? Michael asked, an edge to his voice. To see if we'd treat you differently once we knew you were rich? I shook my head. Not a test, a conclusion. Alex approached the table again, his timing perfect as always. I hope everything was to your satisfaction tonight. My father reached for his wallet. Yes, excellent as always. I'll take the check. Oh, there's no check tonight, sir, Alex said with practiced ease. Ms. Morgan has a standing arrangement with us. And there it was, the final piece of the evening's revelation, delivered not as I had imagined it in my planning, but effectively, nonetheless. Ms. Morgan? My mother repeated, confused. Yes, Alex confirmed, turning to me with the respect of someone addressing his employer's boss. Thank you again for dining with us tonight, Ms. Morgan. And thank you for the staff holiday bonus last month. Everyone was incredibly grateful. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto me, registering the shift in Alex's demeanor, the confirmation of everything I had revealed. This wasn't just about owning the restaurant. It was about the relationship, the respect he showed me not because of my family connection, but because of who I had become in my own right. You're welcome, Alex, I said warmly. Please tell Paolo the desserts were perfect, as always. I certainly will. He nodded respectfully before withdrawing. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with realization, with mental recalibration, with the discomfort of people confronting their own misjudgments. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she set down her dessert fork. My father's expression had shifted from calculation to something more complex. Perhaps regret. Perhaps simple shock. Elise looked like she might cry. Michael's face had gone completely unreadable, a mask of control hiding whatever storm of emotions was happening beneath. I gathered my purse and stood, surprisingly calm. The vindication I had expected to feel had been replaced by something quieter, more bittersweet. Success hadn't made me whole in their eyes. It had simply made me visible. And in that visibility was the painful truth. They had never really seen me at all. "You're leaving?" my mother asked, something like panic in her voice. "But we haven't even had coffee yet." "I have an early meeting tomorrow," I said. "Rebecca," my father began, leaning forward with the expression he used when closing important deals. "I think we need to discuss this further. As a family, this changes a lot of things." "Does it?" I asked simply. "What exactly does it change?" He blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of the question. "Well, obviously, your financial situation is significantly different from what we understood. That has implications for estate planning, for family investments, for how you see me," I finished quietly. "No, that's not what I meant," he backpedaled, though we both knew it was exactly what he had meant. Michael stood abruptly. "I'll walk you out." I was surprised. Of all the family members who might offer a gesture of connection in this moment, Michael was the last I would have expected. "Thank you," I said cautiously. My mother half rose from her seat. "Rebecca, darling, we should have lunch this week, just the two of us. There's clearly so much to catch up on." 3 years of silence, and now she wanted lunch. 3 years during which she hadn't once called just to ask how I was doing, without an agenda of comparisons or suggestions for improvement. "I'll check my calendar," I said non-committally. "Your sister's wedding is in 3 months," she continued, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "We've been planning the rehearsal dinner, and now that we know about your situation, perhaps you'd like to—" "Mom," Elise interrupted, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Stop." My mother looked at her in confusion. "What?" "I'm just saying that Rebecca might want to be more involved now that we know she can afford it," I supplied. "Is that what makes me worthy of inclusion?" "That's not what she meant," my father said sharply. "Isn't it?" I asked gently. "Would you have invited me to help plan the rehearsal dinner 3 hours ago, when you thought I was still answering phones at a small real estate office?" None of them answered. The silence was answer enough. "I'll be in touch," I said, not unkindly. "Good night, Mom, Dad, Elise." With Michael a step behind me, I walked through the restaurant toward the exit. Staff members nodded respectfully as I passed, not obsequiously, but with the genuine regard that comes from fair treatment and mutual respect. I had made a point of learning all their names when I took over ownership, of implementing profit sharing, and health benefits that exceeded industry standards. Bellini's had always been special to me. Ensuring it remained special for the people who made it run was a priority. Outside, the evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain on its way. The street lamps had just flickered on, casting pools of golden light on the sidewalk. I paused, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the evening settle around me. Michael stopped beside me, hands shoved in his pockets, his usual confidence dimmed by the revelations of the evening. "So," he said finally. "So," I echoed. "All this time you've been—" "What?" "Secretly building an empire while letting us think. You were struggling?" I turned to face him. "I wasn't secretly doing anything, Michael. I was living my life, building my business. The secrecy was in your assumptions, not my actions." He frowned. "But you never corrected us. You let us believe that I was a disappointment?" I finished. "Yes, I did. After a while, it seemed easier than fighting for recognition you weren't prepared to give." "That's not fair," he said, though there was less certainty in his voice than usual. "Isn't it? When was the last time you asked me about my work and actually listened to the answer? When was the last time you considered that I might have something valuable to contribute to a conversation about business or investments or anything else you consider important?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes focused on something in the middle distance. Finally, he sighed. I don't know. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. What do you want now, Rebecca? He asked, and for once there was no challenge in his voice, just genuine curiosity. A public apology? Family recognition of your success? What was tonight about, really? I considered the question carefully. What had I wanted? When I planned this dinner, purchased this restaurant, arranged this moment of revelation, what outcome had I been seeking? I think I wanted to know if I still cared. I said finally. If your approval still mattered to me. If being invisible to my family still hurt the way it used to. And does it? I looked up at my brother, the golden child, the one whose accomplishments had always been celebrated, whose opinions had always been valued, whose place in the family had never been questioned. For so long, I had measured myself against him and found myself wanting. For so long, I had hungered for the respect he received effortlessly. Less than it did, I said honestly. But yes, it still hurts. Not because I need your validation anymore, but because it's sad to be unseen by the people who are supposed to know you best. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps even regret. I don't think any of us knew what to do with you, he said slowly. You were always so different, quieter, more internal. Dad and I were bulldozers. Elise is a performer, Mom is a director. But you were always watching, thinking, seeing things the rest of us missed. And that made me less? I asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. He shook his head. Not less, just inscrutable. And I think maybe we didn't like not being able to categorize you easily. So we created a category that made sense. To us, the cautious one, the one who needed protection, guidance. It was easier than admitting we didn't understand you. It was more insight than I had expected from him, more self-awareness than he usually displayed. You could have asked, I said quietly. You could have tried to understand. Yes, he acknowledged. We could have. He paused, then added, I could have. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstanding hanging in the air between us. Are you happy, Rebecca? He asked suddenly. With your life, your work, are you actually happy? It was such a simple question, but one no one in my family had ever thought to ask me before. They had questioned my choices, judged my progress, compared my achievements to their expectations, but they had never simply wondered if I was content with the life I had built. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I am. My work challenges me. I've built something meaningful. I have people in my life who see me clearly and value what I bring to the table. He nodded slowly. Good. That's good. Then, with a hint of his usual competitive spirit, he added, though I still can't believe my little sister outmaneuvered me in business without me even noticing. That's going to take some time to process. I smiled slightly. Take all the time you need. Dad's going to try to get you to bring your business to the firm, he warned. Now that he knows what you've built, he'll see you as the client he missed, rather than the daughter he misunderstood. I know, I said. That's who he is. And Mom will suddenly want to introduce you to all her friends, parade you around like her successful daughter who she always believed in. Probably, I agreed. Does that bother you? I considered the question. It would have once, but now? I shrugged. They're doing the best they can with who they are. I've stopped expecting them to be different. He studied me for a moment. When did you get so wise? Somewhere between being ignored and building a life worth noticing, I replied. A car pulled up to the curb, my driver right on schedule. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly at the sleek black Audi. Your chariot awaits, Ms. Morgan? He asked, a hint of his old teasing in his voice. Just a car, Michael, I said. A comfortable one, but still just a car. As the driver stepped out to open the door for me, I turned back to my brother. You know, success didn't make me a different person. It just gave me the freedom to be who I already was, without apology. He nodded slowly. I'm starting to see that. I hesitated, then added, You should come by the office sometime. See what we're working on. If you're interested. Something, like surprise, crossed his face, followed by a cautious smile. I might do that. Good night, Michael. Good night, RJ, he replied, using my professional name for the first time. A small acknowledgement of the parts of me he had never bothered to see before. As the car pulled away from the curb, I watched my brother standing on the sidewalk through the tinted window, growing smaller in the distance. Inside Bellini's, I could see my parents and Elise still at the table, my mother gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Whatever narrative they were constructing about tonight, about me, was theirs to create. I was no longer auditioning for a role in their story. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, a reminder about tomorrow's meeting. With the City Planning Commission about the affordable housing component of our newest development, real work, meaningful work that had nothing to do with family approval or childhood wounds. As we turned the corner, Bellini's disappeared from view. It would always be there, a landmark in my personal geography, the place where family dinners had once left me feeling small and inadequate, now transformed into a symbol of how far I had come. Not because I owned it, but because I had finally understood that my value was never dependent on their recognition of it. The car moved smoothly through the evening traffic. Rain had begun to fall, gentle droplets catching the glow of streetlights and transforming into momentary jewels on the window. I thought about the young woman I had been 3 years ago, walking away from a family dinner with tears streaming down her face, vowing never to subject herself to their judgment again. I wished I could tell her that the freedom she sought wouldn't come from their validation, but from her own. My phone buzzed again. A text from Jennifer, my closest friend and the chief operating officer of Meridian, checking in on how Operation Family Dinner had gone. I smiled slightly, grateful for the people in my life who knew me, really knew me, and supported me anyway. Or perhaps because of it. How did it go? She had written. Vindication or disappointment? I thought for a moment before replying. Neither, or maybe both, but mostly closure. She responded immediately. Drink later to celebrate? Commiserate? Absolutely, I typed back. My place, 9 p.m. Bringing that ridiculous expensive tequila you like. This is why you're the boss, she replied with a laughing emoji. I slipped my phone back into my purse, leaning back against the leather seat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to build something meaningful. Tonight had been about the past, necessary perhaps, but finished now. The rain fell harder, washing the streets clean. Through the windshield, I could see the lights of downtown approaching, the skyline I had helped reshape with careful investments and thoughtful development. From this distance, the Harborview Hotel was visible, its historic facade now illuminated with subtle lighting that highlighted its architectural details, while the interior was being transformed into spaces where people would live, work, and create community. It was the project I was most proud of, not because of its size or profitability, but because it preserved something beautiful while making it relevant again. I thought about my family, still sitting at that table in Bellini's, perhaps finally having a conversation about me that acknowledged who I actually was, rather than who they had decided I should be. Maybe something would change between us. Maybe not. Either way, I was no longer waiting for their approval to begin my life. The car pulled up outside my building, a converted textile factory with soaring ceilings and massive windows that I had carefully restored 5 years ago, before anyone else saw the potential in this now thriving neighborhood. The doorman smiled as he opened the car door for me, holding an umbrella to shield me from the rain. "Good evening, Ms. Morgan," he said warmly. "Nasty weather we're having." "Good evening, Joe," I replied. "How's Mia doing with her college applications?" His face lit up at the mention of his daughter. "She got into NYU yesterday. Early decision. That scholarship program you told us about made all the difference." "That's wonderful news," I said, genuinely pleased. "She's worked so hard. You must be very proud." "Bursting with it," he admitted. "First one in our family to go to college." "She's going to do great things," I said as we reached the lobby doors. "Tell her congratulations from me." "Will do, Ms. Morgan. Have a good night." "You too, Joe." As the elevator carried me up to my apartment, I thought about Joe's face when he talked about his daughter. The unconditional pride, the genuine interest in her pursuits, the belief in her potential that had nothing to do with whether her achievements reflected well on him and everything to do with wanting her to be fulfilled. I wondered if my parents had ever looked that way when speaking about me. I couldn't remember a time when they had, but I could remember Jennifer's expression when I closed the Harborview deal after months of complex negotiations. I could remember my mentor Howard's face when I presented my first successful business plan. I could remember the city council members' response when she saw our proposal for incorporating affordable housing into our luxury development without segregating the units. Somewhere along the way, I had built not just a business but a life filled with people who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. People who didn't need me to be different to be worthy of their respect. The elevator doors opened directly into my apartment, a space I had designed to reflect who I was rather than who anyone expected me to be. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with the eclectic mix of business texts, historical, biographies, and fantasy novels that had always been my secret escape. The furnishings were comfortable rather than showy, though the art on the walls, pieces by local artists I had discovered and supported early in their careers, was valuable now, both financially and emotionally. I kicked off my shoes and padded to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water before moving to the wall of windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. My city, in many ways, shaped in small but significant ways by my vision, my investments, my belief in what it could become while honoring what it had been. From this height, I could see Bellini's, a tiny glowing point in the distance. I thought about the wobbly chair near the kitchen entrance, where I had sat for so many uncomfortable family dinners over the years. I had given specific instructions that it be fixed when I took over ownership, a small but symbolic repair. My phone buzzed again. A message from Michael. "Just so you know, Mom's already planning how to casually mention her successful real estate developer daughter at her next charity committee meeting." I smiled slightly, not surprised. "Tell her Meridian would be happy to sponsor their next event if it's for a good cause." "You're going to create a monster," he replied. "I can handle it," I texted back. And I could. Because the difference now was that I no longer needed her approval. I could engage with my family on my own terms. Generously but with boundaries, with love but without expectation. I could be kind without being diminished, generous without being exploited, present without being invisible. The rain continued to fall, a gentle percussion against the windows. In the distance, lightning briefly illuminated the sky, followed, several seconds later, by the low rumble of thunder. I had always loved storms, the raw power of nature, the reminder that some forces can't be controlled or contained, only respected. I thought about the young woman I had been, always trying to fit into the narrow space my family had designated for me, always hungry for recognition that never came, always feeling slightly off balance, like that wobbly chair at Bellini's. That young woman had craved validation so desperately that its absence had shaped her self-perception, had made her question her own worth, her own vision, her own voice. But validation, I had learned, was like that lightning outside, a brief, dramatic illumination that fades quickly, leaving you in darkness again unless you have your own internal source of light. And somewhere along the way, I had found that light. In the work that fulfilled me, in the relationships built on mutual respect, in the quiet certainty that I was building something of value. My family had seen me tonight, really seen me, perhaps for the first time. But the revelation that had mattered most wasn't their recognition of my success. It was the realization that I no longer needed it to know my own worth. The thunder rumbled again, closer now. I stood at the window, watching, the storm feeling strangely peaceful. Tonight had been a kind of ending, but also a beginning. The final release of expectations that had bound me to patterns that no longer served me. The first acknowledgement that the family I had been born into and the family I had chosen could coexist without one diminishing the other. Jennifer would arrive soon with her ridiculous tequila and her unfailing ability to see the humor in every situation. We would sit on my balcony if the rain stopped, or curled up on the sofa if it didn't. And I would tell her about my mother's face when Alex called me Ms. Morgan, about my father's rapid recalculation of my net worth, about Michael walking me to the car and calling me RJ. She would laugh in all the right places and be indignant on my behalf where appropriate, and then we would talk about tomorrow's meeting and the new development proposal and whether the time was right to expand to the East Coast. And tomorrow, I would wake up and continue building the life I had chosen, not in opposition to my family's expectations, not to prove them wrong or make them sorry, but simply because it was mine. My vision, my purpose, my story. The thunder crashed directly overhead, and for a moment, the entire sky lit up with lightning, illuminating the city in stark relief before plunging it back into shadow. Some dreams are born in darkness, nurtured in silence, and revealed only when they have grown strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Some victories are quiet, measured not in applause, but in the steady beat of a heart that no longer races when judgment comes. I turned away from the window, away from Bellini's glowing in the distance, and moved deeper into the home I had created for myself. The past would always be there, like the restaurant on the corner, a landmark in my personal geography, but it no longer dictated my destination. Some tables don't need to be balanced to be whole. Some stories don't end with vindication, but with something quieter and more profound. The soft, certain knowledge that you are exactly where you are meant to be, becoming exactly who you were always meant to become, with or without witnesses to the transformation. In the gentle silence of my apartment, with the storm raging outside and the city lights blurring in the rain, I raised my glass in a solitary toast, not to success or revenge or even closure, but to the journey from invisibility to self-recognition, and the freedom that comes from finally understanding that the most important witness to your life has always been yourself.